Hi, good evening, everyone, and welcome to week number 7, if you can believe that, for PPA 500. So we are almost done. Next week is our final week of our class. So we are very much in the home stretch. Just a couple of quick reminders before we cover the information remaining for our semester together. We'll cover all that information tonight. So I think we have a really good chance that after tonight's session is over, we'll have covered all the information necessary. You'll certainly have all the information you need to do a good job on the final assessment. And I don't think we'll have much of a problem getting through all the information this evening. But a couple of reminders. First reminder is that next week you have 2 assignments left. You have your Canvas essay number 5, and the Canvas essay number 5 is due on the 13th. And then you have your final assessment that we looked at last week. And so that is then due a week from tonight, no later than midnight. So those are your last 2 assignments. For Canvas essay number 5, you're going to use the information we covered last week when we talked about public policy, and specifically those 4 different decision-making models: the rational, comprehensive, incrementalism, mixed scanning, and garbage can approach to making decisions. And what I'm asking you to do in Canvas essay number 5 is to select a public policy that you are interested in or that you are familiar with, and then talk about which of those decision-making models you see at play in the formulation of that policy that you have chosen. And then, are there any other decision-making models of those 4 that you think would have been more appropriate than the decision-making model that was used to formulate that policy? So what type of decision-making model was used in the formulation of that policy? And then if you think that there's another decision-making model of the 4 that's more appropriate, which one do you think is more appropriate, and why do you think it is more appropriate? So again, it's completely up to you in terms of the policy that you select. It should be something that you are either interested in, something that you have some working familiarity with, perhaps with your organization, so that you can really speak to how the policy is formulated and which of those decision-making models you see in the formulation of that policy. That I think, again, will tie up a lot of that policy type of information that we covered last week pretty well. So that's your Canvas essay number 5. And as always, remember to respond to 2 of your classmates. For Canvas essay 4 this past week, as I said, I didn't provide any feedback on that because it was just the same discussion that you had on your midterm assessment. And I already provided feedback on the midterm assessment, so I thought it was kind of redundant to provide feedback again. So that's why I didn't provide any feedback on Canvas essay 4. I will go back to providing feedback, though, on Canvas essay 5. So Canvas essay 5 is due on the 13th by midnight, and then the final assessment due next week on the 14th, no later than midnight. So those are your last 2 assignments you have for the class. Also, just to let you know, the course evaluation period is open for this course now. And so if you haven't gotten an email yet, you will get an email very soon with a link to go and do the course evaluation. And that link will then be open for 7 days. And so I do ask that you go ahead and do that course evaluation. We're doing all course evaluations online now, and so they have a prescribed window in which the course evaluation will be open. But if you haven't gotten that email yet, you should be getting that email probably within the next 1 to 2 days. And I think that's it for the announcements for tonight. Where we are at now is we are right in the middle of this discussion of the functions of public administration and talking about what public administrators do. And last week we talked about public administrators and the role that they play in terms of public policy, formulation, implementation, and evaluation. We also talked about the role that they play in program evaluation. We also then talked about when you're involved in policy formulation, implementation, and evaluation, as well as program implementation and evaluation, you are doing it for the purpose of trying to achieve effectiveness. And so we then had a discussion about effectiveness, different ways of measuring effectiveness, but we are really talking about policy and program evaluation in terms of some of the functions that are done by public administrators. This week, we are going to conclude our information by looking at 2 other very important functions of public administration: the management of human resources and the management of fiscal resources. So first half of class tonight, we'll do management of human resources. We'll take a brief break. And then the second half of class, we will talk about the management of fiscal resources. But again, our purpose tonight is not to delve too deeply into these topics, but rather just kind of give you an introduction into how we manage human and how we manage fiscal resources to get you ready then for your PPA 577 Human Resource Management course and your PPA 555 Public Budgeting course. We've already gotten you ready for 670 Policy Analysis, gotten you ready for 696 Research Methods, and then the week prior to that, when we talked about theories, we got you ready for your PPA 660 Organization Theory course. Once we're done tonight, again, you'll have all the information that you need in order to do the final assessment, and you'll have the kind of holistic introduction into the program and a little foreshadowing of some of the courses and the topics that you'll be covering throughout your time in the MPA program. So before we get into our Management of Human Resources information, are there any questions or anything at all before we get started tonight? We all good? Okay, the way in which I usually like to talk about the management of human resources is to first recognize that it is a very important function in public administration because, as I've mentioned before, upwards of 85 to 90% of the money that we spend in our general fund budget goes toward managing our human resources. That money is spent on salaries as well as benefits. So a huge chunk of the general fund revenue that we spend goes toward the management of human resources. But before we get into some of the specifics about how we manage human resources in the public sector, we need to kind of talk about the development of public employment and how we got to the current system of career civil service that we have in the federal bureaucracy. So how do we get where we are with public employment and human resources? We have gone through some distinct eras of public employment throughout our history. The first era of public employment was what we refer to as the era of gentlemen, or sometimes called the era of legitimacy. And the era of gentlemen, the era of legitimacy, starts with the founding of the country in the late 1700s and runs up until 1828. And so from the founding of the nation to 1828, in this era of gentlemen, we were hiring people to work in public administration based upon who they were. So we were hiring people who were from the quote unquote best social background. So people who came from prominent families, people who came from prominent educational backgrounds. These are people who had money. These are people who were creditors. Those are the people we were hiring to work in the federal bureaucracy. So the shorthand is we were hiring people based upon who they were. The reason for that is obvious. The reason for that is that we needed to add some legitimacy to this new fledgling national government. We wake up tomorrow morning and we fully expect that the national government will be there waiting for us. We fully expect that the departments and agencies, the executive branch, Congress, the judiciary, it'll all be there for us, that there's some permanency to our national government. There wasn't that same expectation for permanency in the late 1700s and the early 1800s. So we had to really build people's faith in the national government as a legitimate government, as a legitimate institution. And so we did that by hiring these well-respected, quote unquote, gentlemen. And it's called gentlemen, obviously, because it was only males who were working in public administration, but hiring these quote unquote gentlemen to add legitimacy to the federal government. Then we had this, I mentioned in this class before, this corrupt bargain, this election in 1824. Whereby we had the situation where John Quincy Adams and Andrew Jackson and Henry Clay were the three main candidates for presidency. No one got a majority of the Electoral College vote, and so because no one got a majority, the election then went into the House of Representatives. In the House of Representatives, John Quincy Adams and Henry Clay brokered a deal by which Henry Clay would throw his support behind John Quincy Adams and throw his supporters in Congress behind John Quincy Adams. And in exchange, John Quincy Adams would then make Henry Clay Secretary of State, give him that very prominent cabinet position. So that happened, and that gave John Quincy Adams enough support in the House to become president. The House then declares John Quincy Adams president, even though he had lost both the popular as well as the electoral college vote. That was what we refer to as this triggering event, like we talked about when we talked about policy. We said we usually have big changes in policy and legislation as a result of a triggering event. Something happens that opens up this window of opportunity that galvanizes public opinion around the idea that we really need to make a substantive change to the way in which we are dealing with this policy. That was a triggering event, that corrupt bargain in 1824, to serve as a springboard then in 1828 with the election of Andrew Jackson. And we had a rematch in 1828 where Andrew Jackson then trounced the incumbent president, John Quincy Adams. When Jackson comes into office, he was kind of scarred by this corrupt bargain in 1824. And he brings with him this new approach to hiring people to work in the federal bureaucracy known as the era of spoils or the era of patronage. In the era of spoils or era of patronage, we were now hiring people to work in the bureaucracy, not based upon who they were, but more based upon who they knew. And so the old adage is, to the victor go the spoils. So the winning political party, the winning candidate, would then be able to hand out jobs in the federal bureaucracy to people who supported them in their run for the presidency. Same type of thing happening at state and local governments. If you win the executive office at a state or local government, you and your political party can then dole out these jobs to your supporters and people who helped you get elected. So it's based upon who you knew. Did you support the winning candidate? Did you support the winning political party? There are good and bad aspects to the era of spoils. An advantage of the era of spoils is a lot of loyalty. So these people who are getting their jobs in the bureaucracy are loyal to the people who gave them those jobs. So they're going to remain loyal to that elected official. They're going to remain loyal to that political party. And so you have a lot of administrator loyalty to elected officials and to policymakers. The downside, though, really overshadows that advantage. And the downside is obviously a lack of competence, a rise in corruption, a rise in misfeasance and malfeasance. And we had a lot of issues with trying to do the effective and efficient management of government in the bureaucracy throughout this era of spoils. The era of spoils, the era of patronage, not only reigned at the federal level from 1828 until the early 1880s, but we also saw it in state governments and most prominently at local government levels as well. A classic example are these political machines that really ran most of our large cities throughout the 1800s. Tammany Hall of New York City, the classic example of one of those political machines that really controlled all aspects of political life in New York City. Tammany Hall political machine was able to hand out these jobs to their loyalists as a thanks for helping them get elected to those positions. And I probably mentioned this class before, but there's a very famous book called Plunkett of Tammany Hall. And it's the memoir and the recollections of a man named George Washington Plunkett, who served in Tammany Hall political machine in New York City. And in Plunkett of Tammany Hall, George Washington Plunkett talks about a lot of this, the impacts of this era of spoils, and spoke about very favorably. He was a big believer in patronage in the era of spoils, and really kind of overlooked a lot of the corruption that occurred as a result of that. In his book, he had some passages where he talks about the need to support a candidate as opposed to getting an education. He was had a very negative view of higher education. And there's a line in his book where he talks about education as being filling your head with college rot. And you're better off supporting a candidate working for a political party than filling your head with college rot, because the college rot's not going to get you a job. Supporting the right political party and the right candidate will get you that job in government, and for him, in local government. So he didn't really look very fondly upon people who had qualifications to do the job. The real only qualification was, did you support the right candidate, the winning candidate, and the winning political party? Also in Plunkett of Tammany Hall, and we may have mentioned this when we talked about ethics and accountability, he talked about things such as honest corruption or honest graft, and that there are examples of honest corruption. And his example of honest corruption was he found out that the city was going to buy up some land to put in a park. And so based upon that information, he goes and he buys that land first, then turns around and sells it at a huge profit to the city. So he brokered on public information he got from his public position in order to enhance his private gain. He considered that to be honest graft, honest corruption. He didn't see anything at all wrong with that. As he said in his book, I seen my opportunities and I took them. And that was okay in the era of spoils and the era of patronage. So he had a real problem with a lack of competence. We had a real problem with a rise in corruption. But we've got this era of patronage and spoils at all levels of government that run from 1828 and runs through the early 1880s. The reason why the era of spoils came to an end, at least at the federal level, was we had another triggering event, another event that happened that galvanized public opinion around the fact that the era of spoils probably wasn't the way in which we should hire people to work in the federal bureaucracy. And we needed to make a change to the way in which we hired our public administrators. And so that big triggering event was the assassination of President Garfield. And President Garfield won the election of 1880, assumed the presidency in 1881. And then in that same year, President Garfield was then assassinated by a former supporter by the name of Charles J. Guiteau. And Charles J. Guiteau had written some speeches for President Garfield, thought that because he had written those speeches, even though Garfield never used any speeches from Guiteau, there's no evidence Garfield even knew who Charles J. Guiteau was. But in Guiteau's irrational mind, he felt, I wrote these speeches, so therefore I helped Garfield get elected. Since I helped Garfield get elected, Garfield owes me. And it's the era of patronage, so he owes me and needs to repay me with a job. And he wanted a cabinet level position. Obviously, he did not get that. And so Guiteau then assassinated Garfield. And Guiteau's reasoning was not just retribution against Garfield for not giving him a job, but he had this rational plan in place, or he thought a rational plan, whereby if he assassinates James Garfield's vice president was Chester Arthur. Chester Arthur kind of grew up in political machines, and he was a big believer in the era of patronage and the era of spoils. So if Guiteau gets Garfield out of the way, Arthur would then be grateful because he gets to ascend to the presidency. And since Arthur's a big believer in the era of spoils, he would then give Guiteau a job. Obviously, that didn't happen. Guiteau did not get a job after assassinating Garfield. Guiteau got executed and was hanged because of his assassination of Garfield. So didn't work out all that well for Charles J. Guiteau. But what it does is it serves as this triggering event. And we saw this when we talked about policy last week, these windows of opportunity, these triggering events, or as they call it in garbage can model decision-making, choice opportunities. Whenever these triggering events occur, it then moves us to make major changes in our policy. In the world of public policy, that's referred to as something that's called punctuated equilibrium model. That's what's called the punctuated equilibrium model. Put that in text chat. Punctuated equilibrium model of policymaking. That the status quo usually carries a day, and we continue to do our policies the way we've always done them until this triggering event occurs. When this triggering event occurs, that's when we then make these major changes to our policy. So public policy tends to abide by this equilibrium, this status quo that is punctuated by major changes as a result of these triggering events. And that assassination of Garfield was the triggering event that then led a member of Congress from the state of New York by the name of Pendleton, and you see a picture of Representative Pendleton on the screen. And George Pendleton had been carrying around in his pocket for several years draft legislation to move us from the era of spoils into a new era of hiring called the era of merit. And in the era of merit, we would start hiring people based upon their qualifications. So rather than hiring them based upon who they were, like we did in the era of gentlemen, and rather than hiring people based upon who they knew, as we did in the era of spoils, in the era of merit, we would now hire people based upon what they knew. We would measure their qualifications, measure their knowledge, skills, and abilities, and then hire people who have the requisite knowledge, skills, and abilities to do the job well. So Pendleton had been carrying this legislation around with him for quite a while, wasn't really having a whole lot of success. Some local municipal leagues were also arguing for ushering in the era of merit. We're not having a whole lot of success as well. Assassination of Garfield galvanizes public opinion about the evils of the era of spoils. And then by 1883, the Pendleton Act becomes law. When the Pendleton Act becomes law, we then transition into an era of merit, hiring people based upon their qualifications as opposed to hiring them based upon their political support. So in the Pendleton Act, what we do is we introduce this career civil service system very much modeled after the British career civil service model. And when you read the Woodrow Wilson article, his study of administration, Wilson talks about how important it is for us to be able to borrow innovations like career civil service from other nations and then apply them to our system after making them match our unique political culture. And Wilson talked a lot about the British civil service system and how we were bringing that into America, because that's what we did in 1883 with the Pendleton Act. The Pendleton Act was designed to protect people from dismissals based upon politics. So you could not be dismissed because you supported the wrong candidate, or there's an intervening election and a new party went into power and that new party would then dismiss you. That could not happen. You got your job based upon your qualifications, and you kept your job and could only be removed from your position due to cause, not because of politics, but because of cause. So the Pendleton Act, what we are doing is we are shielding administrators from political influences. So we get that in 1883 and this whole idea of hiring people based upon their qualifications. The problem was that for several decades after that, we knew that we were protecting people from politics, but then we also knew that we had to require something in return. If we were going to tell these career civil servants that they don't have to worry about being negatively influenced by politics, they would not be removed from their positions because of political reasons, we would also have to limit their political activities. And that's what we're asking for in return, is that if you're going to be protected from politics, you then cannot use your public position for political gain. And so 5.5 decades later, we end up getting this act called the Hatch Act. So the Hatch Act is passed in 1939, and the Hatch Act tells public administrators what they can and cannot do in terms of political activities. So you may not campaign during your time when you are working for the public sector in terms of the day that you're working. You cannot use your resources from your office in order to campaign for any political party or for any particular candidate. You are limited from engaging in political activities while you are doing the public's work. So this is what we required back from those career civil servants. The federal level, we get the Hatch Act, and then as a result, all these states start passing their own little Hatch Acts and their own versions of the Hatch Act to make sure their state bureaucrats are not engaging in political activities while on the job. So you then fast forward into the 1970s. So by 1978, we had been in this era of merit now since 1883. We had been living under the Pendleton Act for 95 years. The problem is that in those 95 years, we had added piecemeal legislation here and there to try and clarify aspects of the Pendleton Act. And, the way in which we oftentimes make policy is we see a problem, we make a policy to then respond to that problem. And so little by little, we're adding piecemeal legislation and rules and regulations on top of the original provisions of the Pendleton Act. And it made career civil service somewhat clunky and somewhat confusing. So by the time we get into the 1970s, a lot of career civil servants were very confused about what they could do and what they could not do in terms of political activities. They're very confused about what they could and could not do in terms of pointing out merit violations that occurred to them or occurred to other members of their organization. There really wasn't a mechanism for civil servants to blow the whistle whenever they would see any violations of the career civil service principles. We really didn't have a lot of those mechanisms in place. And so it's a very confusing situation for a lot of career civil servants. when Jimmy Carter comes into office, and he takes office in 1977, by 1978, he signs this piece of legislation into law called the Civil Service Reform Act. In 1978, the Civil Service Reform Act was a whole-scale change to the way in which we did career civil service, and a whole-scale change to the era of merit at the federal level. The Civil Service Reform Act did a lot of different things, and you'll learn more about it when you take your PPA 577 Human Resource Management course. But some of the major initiatives that we got from the Civil Service Reform Act. One, we got the creation of this organization known as the Office of Personnel Management, or OPM. The Office of Personnel Management was designed to be the central clearinghouse for recruitment and hiring into the federal bureaucracy. So this is the era of merit still, after all. And so we need to have some mechanisms we can use to measure the qualifications and the ability of someone to do a job. So we subject applicants to examinations. Those examinations were designed by the Office of Personnel Management. They were vetted by the Office of Personnel Management. They were oftentimes implemented and executed by the Office of Personnel Management. Office of Personnel Management would then take your top 3 or your top 5 scores on the exam, provide that list of eligible candidates to the agency, and the agency would have to hire off of that list. Either it's what we refer to as the rule of 3 or the rule of 5, your top 3 or your top 5 scores on the exam. Office of Personnel Management also was in charge of organizing the recruitment process. So whenever you had a position vacancy, they would help craft the position announcement, the position description, and help what we do call flying that position, advertising that position to recruit people to apply for those positions. So OPM really was this central clearinghouse for all things personnel and human resource management related. Then it also created another organization called the Merit Systems Protection Board, or the MSPB. And the Merit Systems Protection Board is just what it sounds like. It is a board that is created to protect merit principles of career civil service employees. So if a career civil service employee felt that they were being disciplined or otherwise sanctioned or even terminated for reasons other than the quality of their work, for reasons other than cause, they could file a claim with the Merit Systems Protection Board. The Merit Systems Protection Board, in very much of a quasi-judicial investigation type of approach, would investigate this claim from this career civil servant to see whether or not the merit principles were being violated. If they found that someone's merit principles were being violated, then they could order restitution in terms of replacing that person to their position, providing them with back pay for the time in which they were out of their position. You could have those types of restitution that could be given by the Merit Systems Protection Board. So if you felt your career civil service protections were being violated, you would file your claim with the MSPB. Then within the MSPB, the Merit Systems Protection Board, there's another organization that was created known as the Office of Special Counsel. The Office of Special Counsel was initially created within the Merit Systems Protection Board. So it was part of the MSPB. And the Office of Special Counsel was there to hear complaints from employees who are blowing the whistle. So if you're working in an agency and you saw merit principles being violated, so your coworkers were having their merit principles violated, it wasn't occurring to you, it wasn't happening to you, it was happening to someone else in your organization. You as a whistleblower could blow the whistle to the Office of Special Counsel. Then the Office of Special Counsel would engage in their quasi-judicial type of hearing. They would investigate your claim. They would then render a decision about whether or not career civil service merit principles were being violated. But again, you would go to the OSC, the Office of Special Counsel, if you were blowing the whistle on something you saw in your organization. If it affected you directly, you would take your claim to the Merit Systems Protection Board. So we're putting some enforcement mechanisms in place to help enforce civil service principles, to help enforce merit-based employment and hiring. Then another organization that was created in the Civil Service Reform Act was the Federal Labor Relations Authority, the FLRA, the Federal Labor Relations Authority. The Federal Labor Relations Authority was charged with overseeing the collective bargaining process between employee unions and agencies. So whenever employee unions and agencies negotiate a new contract, that collective bargaining process at the federal level is under the auspices of the Federal Labor Relations Authority. The Federal Labor Relations Authority does for public unions what the National Labor Relations Board does for private sector unions and private sector organizations. So this is the public corollary to the National Labor Relations Board. Now, the Federal Labor Relations Authority would hear claims of unfair labor practices and would then issue rulings on these cases of unfair labor practices, either finding in favor of the union or finding in favor of the agency. It would also look at if agencies were keeping employees from organizing into a bargaining unit. They would investigate any of those obstacles that agencies were putting in front of employees who wanted to organize into a bargaining unit. And the Federal Labor Relations Authority had auspices over collective bargaining for every department and agency within the federal government, with the exception of the U.S. Postal Service. The U.S. Postal Service is not covered under the Federal Labor Relations Authority. They are covered under the National Labor Relations Board because the U.S. Postal Service is considered to be a government corporation. It is created by Congress. It's constitutional that Congress creates it, but it operates to run a profit. Not that it does, but it's supposed to operate to run a profit, which makes it a government corporation, kind of like almost a quasi-private type of organization, and that's why it's under the auspices of the National Labor Relations Board. The Federal Labor Relations Authority ran into some trouble in the Reagan administration with the striking of the air traffic controllers, and they were called in to mediate some of these unfair labor practice claims that the Air Traffic Controllers Union had against the Reagan administration when Reagan fired the air traffic controllers who went on strike. FLRA found in favor of the Reagan administration, which then had a chilling effect on the relationship between the FLRA and public employee unions at the federal level. And then your fifth organization that was created there is what's called the Senior Executive Service, or the SES. The Senior Executive Service was an attempt to try and bridge the gap between the political appointees who operate and run our agencies at the top level of our agencies and departments, and then the vast majority of employees in those departments who are career civil servants. So today we have primarily an era of merit. We have primarily merit-based hiring and employment. However, the leaders of our organizations, those secretaries and deputy secretaries of departments, those directors and deputy directors of agencies, typically are political appointees in that they are appointed by the president. Some of them are confirmed by the Senate, some do not require Senate confirmation, but they are political appointees. They provide the overall direction of what the agency is doing and what the agency is trying to accomplish. But all the work, most of the work that goes on a daily basis will be done by the 99% of the employees in that department who are career civil servants. So we had this gap whereby if you were a career civil servant, you were there for a career. If you're a political appointee, you're probably in that position for maybe 18, 24, 36 months, but you're there for a limited period of time. Whenever the president leaves office and a new president comes in, you tender your resignation, and usually it'll be accepted. Sometimes presidents keep on those department heads from previous administrations, but usually they don't. And you tender your resignation and you're usually done. So since you had such a short tenure for your political appointees and career tenure for your civil servants could wait out political appointees that they disagreed with. So a political appointee comes in and says, let's use the Reagan administration, political appointee would come in and say, I want to shutter this department. We believe this department is no longer necessary, and this is what Reagan wanted to do with the Department of Education. And so we're going to eventually gradually shut down the operations of the Department of Education. Well, people who work in the Department of Education disagree with that because that means their jobs. And so they say, well, I'm just going to keep doing what I'm doing, and I'm just going to wait out this political appointee because they'll be gone in a few months, and hopefully we'll get a new political appointee or a new administration that'll be more favorable to the continued existence of the Department of Education. So you have political appointees trying to lead in one direction and career civil servants then going in another. So the hope here is that with the Senior Executive Service, we could create kind of this quasi group of employees who are not completely career civil service, but also not political appointees, but they can occupy this middle ground between the political appointees at the top and then the career civil servants who populate the remainder of those bureaucratic organizations. So essentially what we did with the senior executive service is we took the top 3 levels in the federal bureaucracy and we offered those people the chance to then join this senior executive service. The benefits that they would get would be they get bonus pay. So if their organization is performing well and achieving goals and objectives, they will get bonus pay based upon the success of their organizations. And they also get a lot of flexibility and latitude in terms of moving from one agency to another. It was much easier if they got tired working in their current agency to then move to another agency if they were in the senior executive service. So there were some benefits that were offered to them. The trade-off is in order to get those benefits, when you join the senior executive service, you have to give up some of your career civil service protections. So it is easier to terminate a senior member of the senior executive service than it would be to terminate a normal career civil service employee. So again, it's this whole scale change that we make to the civil service system in the Civil Service Reform Act to try and clarify some things and create some mechanisms, some enforcement mechanisms to further enforce our career civil service merit principles. Now, all of these organizations are still around. All 5 of them still exist now in 2023. So we're 40 some years removed from the Civil Service Reform Act, and they're all still around. Even though they're all still around, they have not all been rousing successes. And I'll give you a couple of examples. OPM, even though it was created to be the central clearinghouse for all things human resource management, all things personnel management, OPM has given up a lot of its functions. And so we've really moved more toward decentralized hiring and recruitment, whereby a lot of the things that OPM used to do, those things are now being done by individual agencies and unit managers and hiring managers within those individual agencies. So the actual roles of OPM have really been curtailed over the past several years as we've decentralized the hiring and recruitment process. The Merit System Protection Board was initially a failure because it was overwhelmed with cases and it didn't have enough staff, and Congress did not provide it with a large enough budget. Now, over the years, Congress has provided with more resources and more staff members, but it still tends to be overwhelmed with a lot of these claims of violations of career civil service principles. The Office of Special Counsel was initially created within the Merit System Protection Board, which meant that it did not have its own staff, it did not have its own budget. In the Whistleblowers Act in 1989, we pulled the Office of Special Counsel out of the Merit Systems Protection Board and made it its own standalone agency with its own budget and its own employees. That was important because when it was in the Merit Systems Protection Board, it didn't have enough staff, it didn't have enough resources, just like the Merit Systems Protection Board did, and it had a huge backlog of cases. And the huge backlog of cases really had a major PR impact on the OSC. And that employees felt, why do we even bother blowing the whistle and taking this case to the Office of Special Counsel? Because it's going to be months, if not years, before they ever adjudicate this claim that I have lodged with them. So it really hurt their public relations standing with a lot of members of the career civil service. The Federal Labor Relations Authority, as I said, really suffered during the air traffic controller strike, and it took them many, many years to try and shake this negative perception that career civil servants had of the Federal Labor Relations Authority because of their decision to side with the Reagan administration in that air traffic controller strike. The senior executive service was never fully funded by Congress. So Congress promised bonus pay to these members of the senior executive service, but never made good on those promises of bonus pay. This kind of takes us back to what's called Vroom's expectancy theory, and this whole idea that if you are a leader or manager and you are promising certain types of rewards, if you don't follow up on those rewards and do not provide those rewards and make good on your promises, you're violating what's known as instrumentality. Congress violated instrumentality by not giving this bonus pay to members of the senior executive service. And every year we do surveys of members of the senior executive service who have been in for many, many years, asking them, if you had to give advice to a newer employee, would you advise that they join the senior executive service? And typically over 70% of respondents say that no, they would not advise newer employees to join the senior executive service, which obviously shows that a lot of senior executive service members are not happy with the trade-off they made, giving up career civil service protections for bonus pay that never actually materialized. So with our Civil Service Reform Act, we have now created this modern system of merit at the federal level in our federal bureaucracy. And we've created this position classification system. The position classification system will classify different positions based upon their duties, their supervisory responsibilities, the qualifications that are necessary, all those things that you do in a job analysis. When you look at each individual job, you then use that job analysis to put these positions in this position classification system so you can assign compensation. By placing these positions in a position classification system, you then have an empirical basis for deciding this position gets paid more than this position because of the content of that job and the requirements of that job. The general schedule is the position classification system in the federal level of government, in the federal bureaucracy. In the past, the general schedule ran from the lowest level was a GS1 position all the way up to a GS18 position. And a GS18 position was the highest level in the career civil service, just under those political appointees who are running the agencies and the departments. In the Civil Service Reform Act, we created a senior executive service by taking the people who are at the GS 16, 17, and 18 levels, the top three levels, pulling them out of this position classification system, and then making them members of the senior executive service. So we no longer go GS1 through GS18. Our career civil service system goes GS1 through GS15, and then those old GS16, 17, and 18 positions are now part of what is called the executive service. And they have now become ES1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 positions. Today, if you're in the federal bureaucracy and you're in a GS15 position, you can apply to go to the Senior Executive Service Academy. In order to join the Senior Executive Service, you have to attend the academy. You have to successfully complete the academy coursework in order to then be eligible to be moved from a GS15 position into an Executive Service 1 position. So we have Executive Service with the ES positions for Senior Executive Service, and then the GS positions for all of our remaining positions in the federal bureaucracy. And again, these are career civil service positions. These are not political appointees. These are people who are hired based upon merit and their qualifications. The advantages of having this career civil service system and this position classification type of system is that you can better achieve equal pay for equal work. You have an empirical basis for deciding how much to compensate each one of these different positions. You're not just arbitrarily compensating them because you like the person in the position better than a person in another position. The compensation is directly linked to the qualifications and the nature of the job itself. The disadvantage is obviously is that once a position is classified, it's kind of locked into what we call a pay band, meaning that it's locked into a level of compensation. Now, every year that you are in this position, you will get a normal raise every single year for a longevity increase, but it's difficult to qualify for a much higher level of compensation unless your position gets reclassified. And so employees will oftentimes ask for a reclassification study. If they feel that their position has changed substantially enough to warrant a much higher salary, they will ask to have their position reclassified. Reclassification studies are very in-depth. They take a whole lot of time. And we'll talk about some of the things we do in reclassification studies in a couple of minutes, but it takes a lot of time. It takes a lot of resources. It also creates a domino effect in that when one or two employees ask to have their positions reclassified, if their positions do get reclassified to a higher classification level, then those people at the higher classification level are going to say, wait a second, I want my position reclassified so that I get paid more as I used to than this other position. And so they'll ask for reclassification study. And then the people above them will ask for reclassification study. And it really ends up kind of being this slippery slope where you spend all your time as an organization just conducting reclassification studies. But the way in which the general schedule looks, and these numbers are a little bit old, they're from a couple of, well, 3 or 4 years ago, but to kind of give you a general idea of what it looks like. So in the general schedule, we have grades GS1 through GS15. And then we have steps within each one of those grades. And so for longevity, as you move up your years in one grade, you will then move up your compensation levels. But in order to move from a GS, say, 12 to a GS 13, that position would have to be reclassified based upon a substantial change to the nature of the job. And then again, as I said, above the GS 15, you then have your ES 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, your members of the senior executive service. But this is kind of your classic position classification system, whereby you have grades and you have steps, and every grade has a different pay band that's associated with those grades. Entering the federal bureaucracy, if you enter it with an MPA degree, and if you have no years of experience, so you're going to substitute a couple of years of your education for a couple of years of experience, you're probably going to enter the general schedule somewhere around maybe a GS 12, a GS 13, depending upon the position. But that's about where you're going to fall with an MPA degree. If you have an MPA degree plus you have more than 10 years of experience, that's when you're probably going to be GS 13 or GS 14 type of position, one grade level away from being able to apply to the Executive Service Academy. But this is our position classification system that we use at the federal level. It's called the general schedule. So when we talked about our theoretical approaches to public administration, we talked a lot about the difference between classical theories and neoclassical theories, differences between the classical school of thought versus a human relations and human resource management school of thought. Today, the way in which we manage employees at the federal, state, and local level, we try and manage them more in line with a human resource management school as compared to the old classical school of Weber and Taylor and Gulick. We really do try to adhere to the McGregors and the Chris Argyris types of theories of helping people along their personal growth path and helping develop people as human resources. So a lot of our focus today in terms of managing human resources has really been placed upon professional development, providing those training and development opportunities, not just to remedy poor performance, but also to help people develop as human resources. So it's a much more neoclassical approach that we use today in managing our public administrators. So how do we manage those public administrators? What are some of the discrete functions in the human resource management process? Well, obviously, the first step is going to be recruitment. You need to, as Graham Allison told us, everyone in every organization, every leader in every organization needs to staff their organizations. So you need to get the people in your organization who have the requisite skills and abilities in order to do the job, the people who have the KSA's knowledge, skills, and abilities. As we know, the hiring process, the recruitment process in the public sector is far more detailed and far more protracted than what you have in the private sector, because in the public sector, we're hiring career civil servants. In the private sector, we're hiring at-will employees. And we've been across this issue of career civil servants and at-will employees many times in this course. And so I think you have a good idea of the difference between the two. So in the recruitment process, we have to not only be sure that we are treating people fairly, we have to try and ensure social equity, achieve a representative bureaucracy, while still having people in the organization who will be efficient and can help the organization achieve its goals of effectiveness. So what we tend to do in our recruitment is we tend to sometimes do targeted recruitment, where we'll create as diverse of a labor pool as possible, diverse as applicant pool as possible. We hire here at Cal State Long Beach. We go through the Office of Equity. It was the Office of Equity and Diversity. I think it has a different name now, and the Office of Equity and Diversity will need to actually sanction our pool, to look at our pool to see, is our pool diverse enough? If our pool of applicants is diverse enough, then Equity and Diversity will sign off on that, and we can then move forward in the recruitment process. When we do our telephone interviews, they will then once again go back and look at that pool that's being used for the telephone interviews to make sure that it is diverse enough. Once we get to the point of bringing 3 candidates to campus, it will once again, the Office of Equity and Diversity will look at that pool to make sure that it's diverse enough and will certify that pool. So for hiring one position here at Long Beach, you have to have a certification of your pool 3 different times by the Office of Equity and Diversity. And you get these diverse pools by doing targeted recruitment. And whenever we hire a faculty member, we do targeted recruitment, advertising, and different targeted sources. We also, when I was here, I would send out letters to the heads, the chairs of PhD departments across the country that served underserved populations. You do a lot of these types of things to try and get the most diverse pool you can possibly get. Recruitment is a long process. Recruitment used to be a very centralized process, centralized through OPM at the federal level, centralized through civil service commissions at the local level. Now recruitment is a much more decentralized process, giving hiring managers and agencies a lot more control over how they do their recruitment. Once you have your applicant pool, then you have to decide which of those applicants fit the job the best and which of those applicants to select. In the past, we used a lot of examinations, and the examination at the federal level is referred to as the PACE exam, the PACE exam. And the PACE exam was a centralized examination created by the Office of Personnel Management, administered by the Office of Personnel Management, and that was the primary criterion on which you would get your job is performance on that examination. Today, we have again decentralized it and taken a more holistic view by hiring people based upon not their score on an exam, but rather their knowledge, skills, and abilities. So we'll take a more holistic look at their experience, at their education, their qualifications as expressed by their resume and by their references, and kind of take that more holistic view of selecting employees as opposed to just their performance on exams. If we have the time, the resources, some agencies will use what are called assessment centers. And an assessment center is you bring in potential employees in on maybe a Saturday morning into a simulated work environment. You then observe them doing the work in the simulated work environment. The idea being that's a more valid way of deciding who has the skills in order to do the job. Problem with that is the Hawthorne effect that we got from Elton Mayo studies, that if you're watching someone do a job in this assessment center, chances are they're probably going to work harder and be more productive than perhaps they will be when they're not being watched once hired into the position. We select people, then the next step obviously is to onboard those people into the organization, to acclimate them to the organization culture, to the function, to the goals and the objectives of the organization. A lot of organizations overlook onboarding, but onboarding is an extremely important process after you have selected an employee, again, to get them acclimated to the organization and what the organization does and what it stands for. Once you have onboarded those employees, then you need to allocate work. So there are a couple ways in which we can do this. One way in which we allocate work is we do it through job evaluations. So we look at each one of our individual positions and we try to determine who's doing what in our organization. As Max Weber tells us, bureaucratic organizations are predicated upon this idea of division of labor and task specialization. So one of the first things that we will do is we will conduct what's called a job analysis. And I'm not going to show you examples of a job analysis here. You'll get that in your 577 course. But in a job analysis, we will look at each one of the individual positions within our organization. We will deconstruct each one of those positions to look at the component elements in each position. We'll ask questions such as, what are the supervisory requirements for someone in that position? Do they supervise other employees? We'll ask questions such as, what are the educational qualifications to be in this position? We'll ask questions such as, what are the conditions of work? Is this a very physical job? Is this a job that comes with some risk of harm? Or is this an office job that really doesn't have any risk of harm, either physical or emotional harm? So we go through our individual jobs, we deconstruct them to see what is going on in each one of these jobs on a daily basis. What are the tasks? What percentage of time is being spent on this task versus what percentage of time is being spent on another task? So it's very much of a deconstructive analysis of each individual job in our organization. Once we have done this job analysis for each position in our organization, we will then use that information to do what's called a job evaluation. So the job evaluation, we are not evaluating performance. We are evaluating each job by comparing each job to each other job within our organization. So we'll look at the position of police chief and the job analysis we conducted for that police chief job, and then we'll compare it to the job analysis for a patrol officer. And then that police chief probably will have budgetary requirements, will probably be leading an entire department of police officers. Patrol officers probably don't have anyone that they're leading. They don't have budgetary requirements or responsibilities. However, patrol officers work in a much more dangerous environment than the police chief would. And so we go through and we do this job evaluation where we compare position to position. One of the most common types of job evaluations that we use is what's called a point factor evaluation. And in a point factor evaluation, we will literally assign points and weighting mechanisms to each element of each job. So for the police chief's job, it will score much higher on supervisory responsibilities, but score much lower on physical harm than the patrol officer job. But we have to determine, well, how important is risk of physical harm as compared to supervisory responsibilities? So we will create all these different factors of the job, and we will then weight those factors, assign points to those factors, and then add up all those weighted factors, and the scores that score the highest, the jobs that score the highest, then get placed in our position classification system higher than other jobs that score lower. So the police chief job probably would score the highest, and that's why it is listed at the top of our position classification system, far above a patrol officer type of position. So again, to clarify, with the job analysis, we are looking at each individual job and what goes on a daily basis within each one of our jobs. Then a job evaluation, we compare jobs versus other jobs. We'll compare all of our jobs together. And the purpose of that is then to place these jobs into this position classification system and then assign compensation and pay grades to all these different jobs in our position classification system. Again, what this will do is this will then hopefully give us some fairness and equity in terms of equal pay for equal work. This is very much an artifact of Frederick Taylor and his scientific management approach. Frederick Taylor in scientific management did job analysis and job evaluation with his time motion studies. And so even though we've moved far away from Taylor's approach in terms of the way in which he looked at individual employees, we are still using artifacts of Frederick Taylor with our job analysis, job evaluation, and the creation of a position classification system. We will not only use the information from our job analysis for a position classification system, but we'll also use that information for the creation of a position description. And most of you in your jobs probably have a position description. That position description will list for you the type of tasks that you will be doing on a daily basis and probably have a percentage associated with each one of those tasks. So 40% of your time may be spent with doing customer service types of work. Maybe 20% will be spent creating documentation and correspondence. That's all given to you in that traditional position description. A more modern approach to the position description is what's known as an ROD. And an ROD is a result-oriented description. In a results-oriented description, we not only list here are the tasks associated with the job and the percentage of time spent on each one of these tasks, but we will also include performance expectations. So if we have a receptionist type of position, someone who works a front desk in an office, one of their jobs may be to refer visitors to the proper office. That's one of their tasks, and they may spend 40% of their time doing that. That would be in a traditional position description. In a results-oriented description, we would then have performance standards. And so a performance standard may be refer visitors to the appropriate office with 100% accuracy. So they always send the person to the right office. That's a performance expectation. Maybe typing correspondence is another task in the job that's perhaps 20% of the job. In an ROD, we would say typing correspondence with a minimum of 60 words per minute and a maximum of 1 error per document or something like that, where we actually have some empirical performance measures that we have built into the position description. That is helpful because then you're cluing the employee in to what is expected of them on a daily basis. What performance level is considered to be satisfactory? Once they know what performance level is considered to be satisfactory, then when you move to the next phase of evaluation, which is evaluation of employee performance, there are no major surprises. Performance evaluation is a very important part of the entire human resource management process. And there is a very famous article by Charles Fox where he likens a performance evaluation to being the keystone in the human resource management process. And he likens human resource management to being an arch made of stones. And the keystone is that middle stone at the very top of the arch, that if you pull that keystone out, the entire arch collapses upon itself. And he argues if you don't do a good job with performance evaluation, then your entire human resource management process will collapse upon itself. The problem with performance evaluation is that no one really likes to do it. Managers don't like to engage in performance evaluation because the stakes are so high that they don't like to, as we call, play God. They don't want to make these very important decisions about whether or not someone will get a performance appraisal that will allow them to be promoted and to achieve moving up in the organization. Employees fear performance evaluation because they fear what's called cognitive dissonance. They fear getting negative feedback for a job that they thought they were doing well. You can make the performance evaluation process more palatable to both managers as well as employees by incorporating performance measures into the position description. So there are no surprises. So if an employee is not performing up to that performance level in their description, they are not surprised whenever they get that negative type of feedback on their performance evaluation. There are a lot of different ways in which we can do performance evaluation. I've listed several different performance evaluation methods up on the screen there for you. I've also provided some examples of them in terms of links in our Canvas site. One of the most common is what's called graphic rating. And we're all familiar with the graphic rating. It's a Likert ordinal scale where you would have, excellent, good, fair, poor, maybe strongly agree, neither agree nor disagree, disagree, strongly disagree. And it's very easy for a manager then to fill out this evaluation by just ticking off those response categories. The problem with graphic rating is if you only use graphic rating, you're not providing a whole lot of formative feedback to your employees to know why they got a good as opposed to an excellent rating. Also, graphic rating lends itself to some errors in evaluation, such as what we call the halo effect. Halo effect is if a manager likes an employee, they will just go down the excellent column for all the different aspects of that graphic rating performance evaluation. Conversely, if they don't like an employee, then they'll just go down all the negative columns. What sometimes happens is what we call a regression to the mean, whereby they just want to go down the middle column to give the employee room to grow. And even though that may not be a representative evaluation of the employee's performance. There are lots of different types of errors that can come up with a graphic rating approach. Oftentimes, when we do use graphic rating, we couple it with essay so that we'll do our graphic rating and then the formative feedback comes in the form of an essay component. Forced choice is where instead of having strongly agree, in those brief response categories, the response categories will actually be phrases. And so we may have a phrase such as, the employee is never late for work. The employee is late for work on average 1 day per month. The employee is late for work on average 2 days per month. And then the manager will then select the appropriate phrase. That's a forced choice type of an approach. A ranking approach is where you literally rank the performance of your employees on a scale from 1 to however many employees you have in that position. Again, not a lot of good formative feedback. The most formative feedback that you can get is usually from this other approach known as the BARS approach. It stands for a behaviorally anchored rating scale. And a behaviorally anchored rating scale, or a BARS approach, it's a lot like a grading rubric in that we are highlighting the behaviors that will lead to a certain type of performance ranking. So an excellent performance evaluation would demonstrate this type of a behavior. And so you see that again in grading rubrics. And so in terms of quality of writing, An excellent score for quality of writing of a paper that you are submitting is a paper that has no errors, that uses scholarly writing style and adheres perfectly to APA 7th edition format. That would be a behavior that would give you an excellent grade. Perhaps a good grade could be if you have maybe one error per page, that's good. It's not excellent, but you've got that behavior. So you're anchoring your ratings based upon specific behaviors, and in turn, then providing that type of formative feedback directly in the evaluation form to your employees. The approach that you use is probably not as important as how you use that approach. It's important to involve our employees in the performance evaluation process from the beginning. So they should be involved in putting together these evaluations, identifying what types of performance expectations there are. And if they are involved in the beginning of putting the performance evaluation process together, then they are more likely to accept the results of that performance evaluation, even if those results are not nearly as positive as they would like for them to be. So again, evaluation is a very time-consuming process whereby you're not only evaluating individual jobs and comparing them to each other, but then you are also evaluating employee performance. Again, when you are doing these job analyses and job evaluations, the more reclassification requests you get, the more job analyses and job evaluations you will need to do. And it really does end up being that slippery slope. When one person asks for a reclassification, many people then in turn ask for reclassifications as well. Then based upon that performance evaluation, then your final stage in human resource management is discipline and sanctioning. So whenever you do this performance evaluation, if you identify subpar performance, for a career civil servant, you must provide that person with the opportunity for professional development. So you must identify relevant training and development and offer those training and development programs to that individual to try and remedy some of that subpar performance. Then after they participate in the training and development, you then, maybe 6 months down the road, do another performance evaluation. If the performance is still subpar, then you will need to provide more opportunities for training and development, and so on and so on. It's very important when you're dealing with career civil servants to document all of these performance deficiencies and document attempts at trying to remedy these performance deficiencies through training and development. If you don't do that, you're going to have grievances, you're going to have potential violations to their career civil service principles, and it could run into a headache for you in terms of trying to then eventually discipline and sanction your employees. There is a common misperception with the career civil service that you cannot terminate a career civil servant. That is not true. You can terminate a career civil servant, but you must do so based upon that documentation. You must have documentation of subpar performance on multiple occasions, and then multiple attempts to redress that through training and development opportunities. If you have documented that and the training and development is still not working after multiple attempts, then you can dismiss someone for cause, but it needs to be very well documented, or else if you're at the federal level, the case can go to the Merit Systems Protection Board, or they can also file a grievance with their public employee union. Now, with at-will employees in the private sector, it's much easier to discipline, sanction, and terminate an employee because they don't have those same career civil service protections. So we are managing human resources. We are managing primarily career civil servants who have these civil service protections. They can only be disciplined and only be terminated for cause. But overlaid on top of these career civil service protections are protections that come out of the collective bargaining process. And a large number of our public employees do belong to public employee unions. And whereas we have seen a big decline in the private sector with union membership, the decline in the public sector with union membership has been much less pronounced. And at the federal level, over 30%, well, 35% of employees actively belong to a federal public employee union. So these public employee unions will negotiate with administration through the collective bargaining process to craft a collective bargaining agreement, a contract that will govern many of these human resource functions and how they are done, including at most levels, with the exception of the federal level, compensation. As you have the bargaining unit, and there's a whole process you go through in certifying bargaining units that are it's kind of beyond the scope of this class to get into, but you'll talk about it when you take 577. If you're very interested in collective bargaining, we also offer class 575 employee-employer relations, which is a required class for the employee-employer relations certificate. In that employee-employer relations class, we will go through all the steps in terms of how you certify a bargaining unit, how you select a bargaining team, how you engage in good faith bargaining, and all those specifics of the collective bargaining process will be covered in depth in 575. But for our purposes here, you'll have a bargaining unit that represents employees in the agency. That bargaining unit will then engage in negotiations with representatives from the administration of the agency. The requirement in collective bargaining is that both sides will engage in what's considered to be good faith bargaining. One example of a violation of good faith bargaining is what's known as regressive bargaining. And so if the union puts forth their proposal, we'll say it's a state or local public employee union, so they put forth a proposal for a 5% compensation increase. And then the administration comes back and says, well, we're going to give you a 3% increase. And then the union says, well, let's settle on a 4% increase. And the administration comes back and says, no, we changed our mind. We're going to give you a 2% increase. You cannot bargain regressively. You cannot bargain backwards. Once you've offered that 3%, you can only go up from that 3%. You cannot go backwards from that 3%. If you go backwards, you're engaging in regressive bargaining. That's considered to be an example of violating good faith bargaining. Good faith bargaining mandates that both parties come to the table to come to a negotiated conclusion. And they come to the table in good faith, wanting to come to a negotiated settlement and wanting to come to a contract. Now, the collective bargaining process, not all issues are within what we call the permissive scope of bargaining. The permissive scope of bargaining tells us what issues may be bargained over. And there are different scopes of bargaining. There is a mandatory bargaining. Those are issues that must be collectively bargained over. There's permissive scope of bargaining. Those are issues that may be collectively bargained over, but they're not required to be. And then there is prohibited scope of bargaining. And those are issues that may not be part of the collective bargaining process. At the federal level, compensation is in the prohibited scope of bargaining. You may not collectively bargain over compensation for most instances of collective bargaining at the federal level. The reason for that is that Congress establishes the compensation of civil servants. There is a compensation committee, a commission, that the members are appointed by the president. One of my colleagues from NASPA who teaches at BYU was appointed by President Obama to be a part of that commission. And a couple times a year, he would go to Washington, D.C., the commission would meet and then make recommendations to Congress about potential increases in federal employee compensation. But Congress makes those decisions about compensation, so they are not included within the permissive scope of bargaining. It's part of the prohibited scope of bargaining. Every state will have its own unique scope of bargaining. In some states, some issues are within the permissive scope, while in other states, they are in the prohibited scope. In some states, they're in the mandatory scope, or in other states, they're merely in the permissive scope. So it really depends upon the state what the scope of bargaining looks like. But the scope of bargaining, those issues that can be collectively bargained over. Collective bargaining can be a very contentious process, and sometimes it's difficult to come to a negotiated settlement and to arrive at a collective bargaining agreement or a contract. When you cannot come to an agreement, then you end up with what's called an impasse, and there are several mechanisms we have in place to help us resolve an impasse to get to a negotiated settlement. One way in which you can resolve an impasse is through what's called fact-finding. In fact-finding, we bring in a neutral fact finder, and that fact finder will then collect information about how the negotiations have been going on, what the proposals have been from the union, what the proposals have been from management, and they will then write a report. That fact-finding report is non-binding. Usually that fact-finding report will be embargoed for at least a couple of weeks, so the only people who can see it are members of the bargaining team. So members of the union's bargaining team and members of administration's bargaining team. And they're the only ones who get to see the fact-finding report. at least for 2 weeks. Then after 2 weeks, it gets released, and then everyone can see what's in the fact-finding report. The idea of embargoing it for 2 weeks is to give both parties an opportunity to come to a negotiated settlement. So that fact-finding report makes the agency look really bad. That's going to put a pressure on the agency to get to work at trying to come to a negotiated contract agreement with the union, or vice versa. But fact-finding is non-binding. It just results in a non-binding report. Then there is mediation. At the federal level, we have an organization called the Federal Mediation and Conciliation Service. And the Federal Mediation and Conciliation Service has trained mediators. And when I was in college, one of my political science professors was a federal mediator who worked for the Federal Mediation Conciliation Service on a contractual basis. And the nice thing for us is that he was never around. He was always off mediating some labor dispute in some other state. But they will send these federal mediators out, and these mediators will then try and come to a resolution between management and the union. Mediation is non-binding. It's just trying to work out the details of an agreement, but it's non-binding on either party. Then you have arbitration. Arbitration typically is binding, where you'll bring in an arbiter from outside. That neutral arbiter will then issue a binding arbitration decision that will then be binding on both parties. If you need to get a conclusion to this negotiation process in timely manner, one approach of arbitration is what's called final offer binding arbitration. And in final offer binding arbitration, the arbiter will come in and say, union, give me your last proposal. Management, give me your last proposal. I'm going to look at those proposals and I'm going to pick one. And the one I pick then becomes the collective bargaining agreement. It is then binding on both parties. So if you really need to resolve an impasse, final offer binding arbitration is the way that you know 100% that you will get that impasse resolved. So through this negotiating process, a collective bargaining process, you then end up with the creation of a contract. At the federal level, the Federal Labor Relations Authority has auspices over the collective bargaining process for federal employees and federal agencies. Here in the state of California, it's CalPERB, the Public Employees Relations Board. And CalPERB is kind of our version of the FLRA. CalPERB will make sure that both parties are negotiating in good faith. If there's a grievance in terms of management saying that the agency, that the union saying that management is not negotiating in good faith, the union can then file a complaint with CalPERB, and CalPERB will then adjudicate and render a decision. So CalPERB is our version of the Federal Labor Relations Authority at the state level here in California. Collective bargaining is important, obviously, because it overlays on top of our career civil service system another set of requirements that public managers need to be aware of in managing human resources. So you not only have to know the career civil service protections that your civil servants have, but you also need to know the protections that are afforded to them in that collective bargaining agreement. Because you not only have career civil service protections that are embodied within government code, and you also have these protections in the collective bargaining agreement, it makes a very complex situation to know all the rules and regulations you need to abide by in managing human resources. That's why there has been a trend in a lot of public agencies to centralize the management of human resources function within a human resource office. Because within that human resource office, you have professional human resource managers. Those human resource professionals are more likely to know in all the ins and outs and all the details of the collective bargaining agreement and all the details of government code better than a frontline manager who may not be aware of all those details. So this centralization has led to an increase in the size and scope of human resource management offices within our agencies, and has really created a cottage industry, if you will, for human resource professionals coming out of MPA programs. I think that's probably one of the reasons why our employee-employer relations certificate is by far the most popular certificate program in the entire MPA program. And we have probably triple the number of people in the employee-employer relations certificate program than what we have in our other two certificates within the MPA program. So it's important to know that on top of our career civil service protections, employees are then also afforded these protections coming out of the collective bargaining agreement. Again, this is just a very quick overview of some of the functions that you do in managing human resources and some of the considerations that you need to be mindful of as you manage those human resources as well. You're not only dealing with career civil servants, but you're also usually dealing with unionized employees. But a lot of our time is spent in our organizations managing the human resource function. I know it's a lot of information, but again, our purpose here is just to kind of give you a little insight into what public administrators do when they manage human resources to then prepare you well as you move on into your 577 course and really delve into detail on a lot of the functions that you do within the human resource management process. So are there any basic questions at this point? I've been talking for a while now, it's 5:20. So any questions at all, any of this information we presented in terms of the management of human resources? Again, just very tip of the iceberg, preliminary type of survey approach to covering that information. At least when you get to your 577 class, a lot of these topics in 577 will not be topics you've never heard of before. At least you'll have a little introduction to those topics. Jay, go ahead.
I just want to say I never heard it explained, like you said, with the level of like employment, you know, through 15 or whatever levels, and then the next 16, 17, 18. And the executive, you know, I liked how you described that. It was very informative, and I have more questions later on personally. All right. So.
Oh yeah. Feel free to reach out. I'm happy to answer them. But yeah, it's a senior executive service. It's again, members of the senior executive service are not, they don't speak very highly of their experience in the senior executive service, but it is a very good career option for people as they move up in the federal career civil service. And if you attend the academy and you get certified to be a member of the SES, obviously you're going to get a high level of compensation. You're still going to get a lot of flexibility in terms of being able to move between agencies. There are still a lot of advantages to being in the senior executive service. And I think people who have years of experience plus the graduate level degree when they go into the career civil service in the general schedule, probably going to go around that GS 13 level, so not far off of being able to qualify then for the senior executive service. So there are still some advantages. I don't want to be too negative about the SES, but it does have some of its problems. And a lot of its problems come from Congress, just not carrying through on what they promised to these members of the SES. Surprise, surprise, Congress not carrying through on something. Go ahead, Jim.
One more thing. I think it's a great disservice to people when they exit high school or even before to not have it promoted so much for public service, for working for the government, state, local, federal, whatever it might be, because it's a lot of opportunity. And I'm going to be straight and blunt. If you graduate from college, let's say 23, 4, 5, do your 30 years, put your $1.5 million in the bank with the savings, you're out at 55 or more, you know, and you can have your life. You know, if you work in the private sector, it's rough. Man.
Right. Yeah, you've got guaranteed compensation in the public sector. Usually you have very good benefits in the public sector. And you're right, if you can squirrel that money away, you can retire with a full pension after 30 years. You're still relatively young and you can retire and then, like you say, Jay, go off and live your life. And I think one of the things that we have seen is we've seen a movement toward public administration education being done not only at the graduate level, but at the undergraduate and even the associate's level as well. And some community colleges are starting to offer public administration programs for folks in their first 2 years of college at the community college level. I think that's a really good thing to get people involved in the public sector and so they can really see what the public sector is all about. Tracy, go ahead.
You mentioned the reclassification process. And that also Congress is responsible for salaries. So in that reclassification process, that's what's happening. Congress is reevaluating the compensation or the raises or whatnot, and then saying, yes, that can happen, or is that an independent process?
That's kind of a separate process. I mean, not really separate, they're connected, but the reclassification process is where we look at the job and see, does the nature of the job, has that changed? And so is this position, are there different requirements now for this position? Maybe in the previous manifestation of the position, you were spending 40% of your time doing this function, and now you're only spending 30% of your time doing the function. And maybe there's a new function, new responsibility that you now have in this position. reclassification study is meant to try and identify how the job has changed. And then once you can identify how the job has changed, that may then change where that job is placed in your position classification system. And then if it changes where it's placed in that position classification system and that it's at a different grade level, it goes from at the federal level, maybe from a GS 11 up to a GS 12, then that means there'll be higher compensation for that position because it has been reclassified to a higher level in the position classification system. In terms of increases in compensation across the board for federal employees, the Compensation Commission will make those recommendations to Congress, and usually the recommendations they make will apply to the vast majority of federal and career civil service employees. So they might make a recommendation that based upon the CPI and based upon inflation rates, that there should be a 3% increase across the board for all federal employees. And that will apply to all federal career civil service employees. That's kind of outside of the reclassification process. The reclassification process is if the substance and the nature of the job has changed over the years, and we then reclassify it in order to capture those changing characteristics of the job. And we do reclassification at the federal level, at the state level, as well as at the local level. And a few years ago in my district, we undertook an entire reclassification effort for every staff position within the entire organization. And that started before COVID, so obviously it got interrupted with COVID, but overall it was about a 2.5 year process. And again, COVID slowed that down, but it was 2.5 years to go through the reclassification study for all these positions throughout the entire organization. So it's a very time intensive, very resource intensive process, but it's vital to do if our jobs are changing, because we don't want people working outside their description. So if the job has changed, that description is going to have to change as well. And the resulting classification of the position will have to change too, in order to assign the appropriate amount of compensation. Does that make sense?
Yep, got it. Thank you.
Okay.
Just on a personal note,
yeah.
I've noticed internally in the CSU system, it's very difficult to be reclassified and to be other things like that to benefit the employee.
Mm-hmm.
Just wanted to say.
I think you're right. Yeah, and I think a lot of it depends upon the individual ASM and the individual college. And yeah, in some colleges, it's notoriously difficult to get a reclassification study done for your position. We did it for one of our staff positions when I was chair, and it was like pulling teeth to get it approved. And then what would happen in that reclassification, we'd do a job analysis for that position, and we'd actually have someone from HR who came and shadowed the employee and would actually sit with that employee for 2 days and watch what that employee did and record what they did on a daily basis, almost like a Frederick Taylor type of approach, to see what they were doing and if that has changed from what they used to do previously. So it is if you think about doing that shadowing for every single one of your positions in the organization, you can imagine just how difficult and how time consuming it really is. And so there is some resistance on the part of management because they don't want to put the time and the effort and the money into doing these reclassifications. The agency reclassification process resulted in a lot of the positions actually being adjusted for new classification. That's a great question, Regina, and the answer is yes, it did. It resulted in a lot of reclassifications and reclassifications upward in the position classification system, which meant that those positions were then qualified for higher levels of compensation and a lot more money being spent on HR as a result of that reclassification. So yes, absolutely it did. And usually there's a basis for doing the reclassification study. It can be requested by an employee. If an employee feels that, yes, my job has changed this much that we need to do this reclassification study. Sometimes they just want higher compensation. They see someone else getting their position reclassified, but oftentimes there's a valid reason. They really do feel that their job has changed and they're now working outside of their position description. So there's usually a valid reason. These reclassifications, if they are done and they're approved by management, they usually do end up with higher levels of compensation. That's an excellent point, because that thing costs us more money, and that then has an impact upon the financial resources that we have to manage within our organizations. And so, Regina, that's an excellent segue into the management of financial resources. Yeah, I know it is unusual. Usually you do it based upon requests from employees, but what the organization realized is that they had not revisited their employees for their positions for a couple of decades. And so a lot of people were working outside their description. And what they found is they were getting a lot of grievances. And so employees are going to the union saying, I'm doing parts of my job that are not parts of my job. I'm doing things that are not part of my job description. And so once you start getting all these grievances and then all your meet and confers with the union, the district decided, well, it's better off we just go back and we just reclassify all the positions if necessary, do an entire reclassification study so we can avoid all these piecemeal grievances that were coming in as a drip, like, multiple per week. And so it's easier just to go back and do a reclassification study. But you're right, it is very unusual to do all the positions within your organization. But this was a school district, and so a lot of the positions are similar in nature, and that you don't have a lot of different positions in terms of your staff. And so even though you're doing every staff position in the organization, you don't have a lot of different staff positions that you were doing. So it made it a little bit easier, but still was a 2.5-year process. We are bumping up against 5:30, so I think you all deserve a break at this point. So let's take a 10-minute break. I hate to short you on your break, but we do have a lot to cover with management of financial resources. So let's take a 10-minute break, come back at 5:40, and then we'll segue into a discussion of managing financial resources, some of the strategies we use in terms of different types of budgets and all those good things. So come on back at 5:40 and we'll talk about managing financial resources. Okay, it's 5:40, so we are back, and let's transition to a discussion then of managing financial resources, and we will make this our final topic for the course. And I think that once we get through this information, we'll then have covered all the information that you'll need for all of your core courses, also cover all the information you need for your final assessment. And thank you, Matt, for the link that you put into the text chat on the process that the CSU went through. So we'll take a look at that, and I appreciate you sharing that with us. Okay, so what we do when we manage financial resources, obviously, is we are managing budgets. And so the basic question then is, what is a budget? I think we all have a pretty good sense of what a budget is. A budget is going to be a statement of how we are spending our money, what we are spending our money on, and how much money we are spending for a future year. So budgets are prospective in nature, in that they look at how we are spending our money in a future year. I like to use a more nuanced definition of budgeting, in that a budget is also a statement of priorities. So if you want to know what a society prioritizes, we look at that society's budget, because governments always have infinite demands and finite resources. So when you have to address infinite demands with finite resources, it means by definition, making decisions about where to allocate those funds. And so what we spend our money on really shows what we prioritize, because we can't spend money on everything. And some things are going to lose out in our budget. But what we spend money on, what we increase our spending on, those are the priorities that we have as a society. So when you deal with a budget as a statement of priorities, it goes beyond just being dollars and cents. And it really gives us that insight into what we prioritize and what we value as a society. There are two basic categories of budgets we tend to use in public budgeting: operating budgets and capital budgets. Operating budgets will usually give us the money that we need for the daily operations of our organization. Capital budgets are for these capital projects, these long lifespan, high price tag, non-recurring types of expenditures. So if we're going to build a new city hall, we're going to construct a new recreation center, if we're going to purchase a new fleet of police vehicles, that would be considered to be a capital expenditure. That would be in our capital budget. Since those are very high price tag, long lifespan types of items, we really try and be more rational in the way in which we make those decisions. And so it's important that we segregate those onto a separate capital budget so that we can have the time and we can really be more rational in the way in which we decide what to fund and what not to fund. We also tend to fund those capital projects often with debt. And so rather than just using our operating expenses, our operating revenue, we'll use debt in order to fund those capital projects. Capital budgets are usually created through the capital improvement project process, where we'll create a capital improvement plan, and that capital improvement plan, or that CIP, will then list out all the capital projects that we are planning on funding for the next 5 years, and that will then inform what goes into that capital budget. So operating budgets are primarily for our day-to-day functions. Capital budgets are for those long lifespan, high price tag, non-recurring types of projects that we fund, oftentimes with issuing debt, borrowing money. So how do we put budgets together? There are different phases in the budgeting process, and what we cover in this class is we cover 4 different phases in the budgeting process. The first phase in the budgeting process is the preparation phase. In preparation, what we are doing is we need to, before we know how much money we can spend, we need to know how much money we think we're going to raise. We need to have adequate revenues in order to make those expenditures. And so we will do forecasts, we'll do revenue estimation, whereby we try and decide how much revenue we're going to have in the future, and then how much revenue we have to spend on those expenditures. In the preparation phase at the federal level, this is where the Office of Management and Budget and the Congressional Budget Office play a major role. So in preparation, the Office of Management and Budget will put out its estimates and its forecasts. The Congressional Budget Office will do its forecast. Oftentimes, the OMB, Office of Management and Budget forecasts, look a lot different than the Congressional Budget Office forecasts because they usually use different types of methodologies. But at the federal level, it's OMB and CBO in the preparation phase. Here in the state of California, it's the Legislative Analyst Office and the Department of Finance. So Legislative Analyst Office is kind of the corollary to the CBO here in the state of California. The Department of Finance is kind of the corollary to the Office of Management and Budget at the federal level. So Department of Finance, Legislative Analyst Office will again create those similar types of revenue forecasts and revenue estimates in preparation of putting our budget together. At the federal level, OMB will put out what they used to call Circular A22, which they would put out a call for budget requests. And then all the different agencies and departments at the federal level would then put their budget requests, submit their budget requests into the Office of Management and Budget. Office of Management and Budget will review those requests, would then oftentimes cut those requests, and then those modified, reduced requests would then be collected together into the president's executive level budget. That executive level budget then is presented to Congress, usually at the beginning of February, either the first or second week of February. And when the president's budget then goes to Congress, we then move from the preparation phase into the formulation phase. Here in California, the governor's budget goes to the state legislature in January, which moves us from the preparation phase into the formulation phase. So in formulation, this is where the legislative body, either Congress or the state legislature, deals with the executive budget and makes decisions about what to include in that budget for the upcoming fiscal year. So throughout formulation, legislative bodies deal with the budget decisions, and they will make decisions about what goes in and what does not go into that budget. At the federal level, once Congress gets the president's budget at the beginning of February, that budget then goes to a House Budget Committee and a Senate Budget Committee. And the budget committees in the House and the Senate are the centralized starting point for consideration of the president's budget. The job of the House and the Senate Budget Committee is to pass a budget resolution, what we call a concurrent resolution on the budget. And that concurrent resolution on the budget must be passed no later than April 15th. The purpose of the concurrent resolution on the budget is to establish the maximum amount of money that we can spend in all of our different programmatic areas. So here's the maximum we can spend on health and human services. Here's the maximum we can spend on Veterans Affairs. Here's the maximum we can spend on education. Here's the maximum we can spend on defense. So it's supposed to impose some fiscal discipline by placing maximum levels of spending in all of our different programmatic areas. And that's called the concurrent resolution on the budget. Sometimes you'll hear members of the mass media on April 15th say, we have a budget when they pass the concurrent resolution on the budget. We don't have a budget yet. We have the parameters that the budget will fit within, but we don't yet have a budget. You then also have what's called the appropriations process in Congress. Discretionary spending, spending that Congress has direct control over, goes through the appropriations process. If you remember back to our discussion of the Constitution earlier on in this semester, we said there was a provision in the Constitution that required that before Congress can remove money from the Treasury, that money must first be appropriated. We said appropriation is basically just saying how you are going to spend that money. So discretionary spending, spending Congress has direct control over, goes through an appropriations process. There is an appropriations committee in the House and an appropriations committee in the Senate. Each of those appropriations committees will have 12 different subcommittees, one subcommittee for each programmatic area. Each of those appropriation subcommittees will then report out an appropriation bill for their area of focus, for their jurisdiction, whether it be education or health and human services. Those bills then get reported back to the parent appropriations committee in the House and the Senate. Parent appropriation committee will then hold hearings and will mark up and make changes to those appropriation bills, and will then pass those appropriation bills out to go to the floor of the House and the floor of the Senate. In the House of Representatives, those appropriation bills go through a rules committee. The rules committee will then establish the rules for the consideration of those appropriation bills when they get to the floor of the House. Usually appropriation bills go to the floor of the House under what's called privileged status, which means that they have very few amendments and there are very limited amount of time that people can debate those appropriation bills. So discretionary spending goes through that appropriation process through those appropriations committees. However, there's a large chunk of the federal budget that is considered mandatory spending. Mandatory spending is spending that Congress does not have direct control over. So in terms of mandatory spending, we're talking about things such as interest on the national debt. Congress borrows the money, Congress has to make principal and interest payments on that money. They don't have a choice. It's beyond the control of Congress, unless they want to default on that debt, which would have catastrophic issues for the world economy. Another example of mandatory spending are programs such as entitlement programs. So entitlement programs are programs in which people, if they meet the legal eligibility guidelines for getting benefits from the program, are legally entitled to those benefits. So think about something like Social Security. Social Security is an entitlement program. Once you reach full retirement age and you're fully vested in Social Security, you are legally entitled to those Social Security benefits. So if Congress wants to reduce the amount of money it's spending on Social Security, it's not going to be able to do that through the normal appropriations process. It's going to have to go back and change the eligibility requirements for gaining access to Social Security benefits. So it might have to go back and increase the retirement age. Goes back and increases the retirement age, that goes through what's called an authorization process and will go through authorization committees. So discretionary spending goes through the appropriations process and appropriation committees. Mandatory spending goes through an authorization process and goes through authorization committees. But all this work will go on throughout April, May, June, July, August, September, and then technically, Congress is supposed to pass the appropriation bills no later than September 30th, so they can be signed by the president before the new federal fiscal year begins on October 1st. The federal level, the federal fiscal year runs from October 1st to September 30th. Here in California, for the vast majority of California agencies, the fiscal year runs from July 1st until June 30th. So we're on a different fiscal year than the federal level. So Congress is supposed to have these appropriation bills, and there are 12 of them for discretionary spending, must all be passed no later than September 30th, signed by the president in order to start the new fiscal year on October 1st. In the state of California, it's a different type of process. In that here in the state of California, we don't have separate appropriation bills. We have one budget bill. That budget bill goes to the state legislature in January, and the state legislature works on that budget. But then the assumptions then change in May. And if you've dealt with the California budget, you know about the May revise. So somewhere around the middle of May, we get this May revise. And the May revise are revised assumptions about the amount of revenue the state is collecting and the amount of revenue the state then has to spend in expenditures. So the way in which the governor's budget looked in January, it may look a lot different after this May revise. So we update the budget based upon the May revise and how revenue's coming into the state. And then throughout the rest of May and through June, the first 2 weeks of June, the state legislature then needs to work on that budget and then pass that budget by June 15th. Once that budget is passed, it then goes to the governor for the governor's signature no later than June 30th for the beginning of the new state fiscal year on July 1st. But here in California, we have a process known as trailer bills. And so we've been relatively successful over the past few years at getting our budgets done on time at the state level. And that's primarily the function of a couple of things. One reason why we get our budgets done on time is we have unified government. There's a supermajority for Democrats in the California Assembly and a supermajority of Democrats in the California State Senate. In fact, I believe there are only 8 Republicans now out of 40 seats in the California State Senate. So you have supermajorities in both of those bodies, plus you have a Democratic governor. With that type of unified government, it makes it easier to agree on priorities and to get those budgets passed and signed into law. Another reason why we've been able to get budgets done on time is that we revised Proposition 13 and we removed the supermajority requirement. So even Democrats have a supermajority. They don't need a supermajority anymore to pass a budget. A simple majority is good enough to pass the budget through the state legislature. Now, you still need a supermajority. You still need a 2/3 majority to increase taxes and increase revenue. But to actually pass the budget, you only need a simple majority. So we've done a pretty good job of getting that budget done and signed by the governor by July 1st, the beginning of the new fiscal year. But even after that budget is signed by the governor, a lot of the details in terms of how that money is being spent and how we're implementing that spending, those details have not yet been fleshed out. Those details will come in a series of what we call trailer bills here in the state of California. So after the budget is passed, we then have the passage of what are called trailer bills. And through July and August and into September, the state legislature will pass these trailer bills, and the trailer bills will give us the specifics about how these monies are supposed to be spent. So what they're supposed to be spent on, what are the eligibility requirements for people to receive benefits from these programs. All those implementation details, or a lot of them, get spelled out in these trailer bills. So even though the fiscal year begins on July 1st, a lot of local governments don't know exactly how they're supposed to spend the money until the trailer bill is passed to give them that type of direction. Now, at the federal level, if we shift back to the federal level, we know that these 12 appropriation bills need to be passed and then signed by the beginning of the fiscal year on October 1st. The problem is that that rarely ever happens. We rarely get all 12 appropriation bills passed and signed by October 1st because of partisan differences. So it's not unusual for us to maybe get 3 or 4, maybe 5 of those appropriation bills through, but the remainder of those appropriation bills are not yet ready and passed and signed in time for the beginning of the new fiscal year on October 1st. So what Congress does is when the new fiscal year begins and we don't have our budget done, is they will pass what are called continuing resolutions, or CRs. Those CRs will then authorize agencies that do not have their appropriations yet to spend at a level of 80% of what they spent last year for that same period of time. So we'll pass a continuing resolution to keep government open for the next 2 weeks, and then those agencies can spend 80% of what they spent for those 2 weeks last year. Those continuing resolutions will then expire after 2 weeks, and then they'll have to pass another continuing resolution. Those then expire, and they'll have to pass another continuing resolution. And they pass these continuing resolutions as they work on passing those remaining appropriation bills. Eventually, Congress or the president will get to the point in time where they will say, no more continuing resolutions. We're done with continuing resolutions. We need to get a budget. At that point in time, you have 2 choices. One choice is to shut the government down. So all those agencies and departments that do not yet have an appropriation bill that's been passed, they no longer have legal authority to spend money. So therefore, you at least partially shut down those agencies and those departments. That leads to a government shutdown. The other option is to take all those appropriation bills that have not yet been passed, squeeze them all together into this mammoth piece of legislation that is known as an OBRA. And the OBRA stands for an Omnibus Reconciliation, Omnibus Budget, well, left out the budget, Omnibus Budget Reconciliation Act. There we go. Omnibus Budget Reconciliation Act, or an OBRA. So all these unpassed appropriation bills go into this OBRA. The OBRA is a massive piece of legislation. It's literally going to be thousands upon thousands of pages. And we oftentimes don't know what we have funded in those OBRAs until sometimes weeks later. And in order to get members to sign off on this OBRA and approve of this OBRA, you're probably giving in to some of their projects. So saying, we will fund your recreation center that you wanted in your jurisdiction if you will support this OBRA. We will fund this new economic development program in your jurisdiction if you will support this OBRA. So OBRAs lead to a lot of overspending. And a lot of our overspending comes from these Omnibus Budget Reconciliation Acts. Make no mistake, Omnibus Budget Reconciliation Acts, that's not the way in which the process is supposed to work. Discretionary spending is supposed to be in those 12 appropriation bills. They're supposed to be passed by September 30th and then go signed by the president and then go into effect at the beginning of the new fiscal year. So we don't get our budgets done on time at the federal level, and we also don't balance our budgets at the federal level either. Since 1969, we've only had 2 years where we have had a surplus, where on the books, at least on paper, our revenues exceeded our expenditures. In every other year since 1969, we have run a deficit at the federal level. But however we get there, once we have those appropriation bills passed, or we've got that OBRA, the new fiscal year begins on October 1st, we then shift from the formulation into the execution phase. The execution phase is actually spending the money. So this execution phase will be in that new fiscal year. So running from at the federal level, October 1st until the following September 30th, at the state level, running from July 1st until the following June 30th. This is where we're actually spending the money. Then at the conclusion of that fiscal year, we then move into the evaluation phase, where we go back and we evaluate how we spent that money. This is where we do our audits. So we'll do legal and financial audits, where we'll look at, did we spend the money in the legally appropriated manner that we were supposed to spend the money? And then we will also do our performance management-based audits, where we'll ask the question, how well did we spend the money? And did spending the money on this program or this policy help us achieve our goals? How effective was the spending of this money? So those are your 4 basic phases in the budgeting process. The phases are similar between the federal as well as the state level, just a few little differences in terms of the way in which you do it in California versus how we do it at the federal level. But the basic 4 phases are still the same for both federal as well as state level budgeting. So what do budgets look like? And again, we're not going to go through the examples of all these different types of budgets. I do have examples with links on our Canvas site. So if you want to look at the examples of each of these 4 different types of budgets, you can do that by clicking on those links. You'll get into these budget formats in much more detail when you get into your 555 public budgeting course. But just kind of from a 30,000-foot level, 4 of the major types of budgets or budget formats that we use in this country tend to be line item budgets, performance-based budgets, program-based budgets, and zero-based budgets. A line item budget is your traditional type of budget. And we've all seen line item budgets before, where we list, here is the object of expenditure, this is what we are spending money on, and here's the amount of money we are spending on that object. So salaries, the amount we spend on salaries. Benefits, the amount we spend on benefits. Supplies, the amount we spend on supplies. Maintenance, the amount we spend on maintenance. That's a very simple line item budget. Line item budgets are good for controlling our expenditures. It allows us to see how much we are spending and what we are spending that money on. But that's about all the information that we get out of a line item budget. A second type of budget that is more sophisticated is what's known as a performance-based budget. And a performance-based budget, beyond just saying this is what we're spending our money on and this is how much money we're spending, we incorporate pieces of that performance budget to show how well we are spending the money. So we have performance indicators. So if we're spending money on, the example I used to use in my budgeting class when I taught back east was a snow removal program. And so we're spending money on this snow removal program. We want to know how well we are removing the snow. And so we'll have indicators of performance, such as the number of miles of snow that was plowed, the number of miles of roads that you had salting to, and we put down that rock salt to keep the snow from accumulating. The number of accidents in which snow was a contributing factor. Those are all performance measures, and we will build those performance measures into our budget so that we can clearly see how well we're spending the money, how well we're accomplishing our goals and objectives with the money that we are spending. With a performance-based budget, we are collecting information in terms of managing our organization, and we're using the budget as a management tool so that we know how well we're spending the money, and we can then decide if we want to reorient that spending onto another program, if spending on this program is not helping us achieve our goals and our objectives. So it's a more sophisticated type of budget than a line item budget. A lot of local governments in the 1990s moved toward performance-based budgeting, where they actually put these performance measures within their budgets. Third type of budget is what's called a program-based budget. Now, a program-based budget is a lot different than a line item or a performance-based budget. Line item and performance-based budgets are oriented around units and departments. So we'll have, here's the police department, and here are all the things we're spending money on for this police department, and then here are the performance objectives for that police department. Then here's the fire department's budget, and every department will have its own separate budget. In a program-based budget, we do not budget according to department, we budget according to program. So we might have a program such as protection of persons and property. That's our program. Protection of persons and property can be contributed to by the actions of the fire department, the police department, maybe emergency services. It doesn't matter where the spending is happening. It matters how that spending is contributing to the program goals. So we organize our budgets around the program rather than the individual unit or department. Whereas a line item budget contributes to controlling the amount of money we're spending, a performance-based budget contributes to how we manage our organizations, a program-based budget contributes to how we strategically plan and how we plan the operations of our organization. It allows us to see how all the different units and departments and their activities work together to help us achieve the same programmatic goals and objectives. Then a fourth type of budget format we typically don't see at the local level, but we do see at the state level and sometimes at the federal level, is what's called a zero-based budget. And a zero-based budget is more of a budget process than a final budget document. In a zero-based budgeting process, what we will do is we will look at the lowest level in our organization where budget decisions can be made. And then we identify that lowest level as being a decision unit. Then all of those decision units will put together a series of what are called decision packages. Each decision package will have different alternative ways of spending the money, and then the consequences of spending the money in those different ways. So, what one decision package may say, funding a bookmobile in a local library. So if we fund that bookmobile at 100% of what we funded it at last year, what are the consequences of that? Well, because of inflationary factors, we're probably not going to be able to provide the same level of service because services become more costly this year than they were last year. So you won't be able to reach as many patrons with our bookmobile as we were able to do last year. Well, how about if we spend 110% on this bookmobile that we spent last year? So we're increasing the spending by 10%. Well, we'll be able to reach X number more patrons. We're going to be able to increase our circulation rates by X percentage. Those are the consequences, the outcomes of spending that extra 10%. But what if we fund it 90% of what we funded at last year, a 10% cut? Well, how many fewer patrons are we going to be able to serve? And what's going to happen then into the decline in our circulation rates? So you have consequences for all these different courses of action within these different decision packages. Those decision units will then rank and prioritize all those different decision package approaches. And then upper level management will re-rank and reprioritize those decision packages. The highest ranked, highest prioritized decision packages then become part of that agency's budget. A zero-based budget is very much of a bottom-up approach as opposed to a top-down approach to putting a budget together. But it is very time-consuming. It is very resource-consuming. It produces a mountain of paperwork because all these decision packages will be multiple pages. If you have 100 decision packages, each decision package is 40 pages, like is required to be in the state of Virginia, the way in which they do zero-based budgeting. You're looking at 4,000 pages that you're going to be dealing with in terms of those decision packages. So it's a really time-consuming way to put together a budget, but it does help us emphasize the planning feature. It makes us go back and re-justify all the things we're spending money on within our organizations. Now, all this being said, for these 4 different budget formats, the most common budget format still is the line item budget. That's the one you're going to see used most often at the local level. That's followed then by performance-based budgets. And you'll probably see some performance-based budget being used by some local governments. Program-based budgets typically are not used at the local level very much. They are used at the federal level, and organizations like the Department of Defense has been using a program-based budget since the 1960s. And then zero-based budgets, typically you're not going to see those at the local level, but you probably will see those in some states. Some state governments use a modified zero-based budgeting process. And under the Carter administration in the 1970s, zero-based budgeting was brought into the federal government, but then left relatively quickly after the Carter administration ended. But again, those are just some different ways in which we can put our budgets together. And I've got links for each of those examples of each of those budget formats if you are interested in our Canvas site, but you will deal in much more detail with those different budget formats once you get to your public budgeting course. In order to spend money, obviously, we need to raise money. So we have to raise adequate amounts of revenue in order to spend the money we feel we need to spend to meet the needs of our citizenry. Revenue can come from 2 general sources, taxation and non-taxation. Taxation-based revenue includes things such as property taxes, income taxes, and sales-based taxes. Property taxes are what we consider to be a wealth-based type of tax, an ability to pay type of tax, in that we are going to index your tax liability to the value of your home as an indicator of your ability to pay that tax. Income taxes are also an ability to pay type of tax, in that your liability is going to be indexed to the adjusted gross income, the amount of money that you are earning. The sales tax, however, is a benefit-based tax, in that you pay the tax based upon the benefit you get from consuming some type of a commodity. So you go and you purchase the candy bar, you consume that candy bar, you derive a benefit from consuming that candy bar, you pay a tax based upon that benefit that you are getting. If you don't purchase the candy bar, then you don't have to pay the tax. That's what we call a benefit-based type of tax. With tax-based sources of revenue, we're always concerned about how progressive or regressive that form of taxation is. A progressive form of taxation will have a lower tax liability for people with less of an ability to pay. So things like if you have a home that has a smaller value, less of a value than another home, you'll have a smaller property tax bill, with some exceptions here in California with Proposition 13, which you'll get into in your budgeting course. With the income tax, again, if you make a lot of money, you'll have a higher marginal income tax rate than if you don't make a lot of money. Again, based upon that ability to pay, very progressive type of orientation. With the sales tax tends to be much more of a regressive form of taxation, in that if you are taxing the staples of life that people need in order to survive, people with less money have less disposable income, and disposable income is defined as the amount of income left after you purchase the staples of life. So if you are applying a sales tax to the staples of life, then chances are you're going to have a very regressive type of taxation. That's why a lot of states have what they call commodity exemptions, so that they will exempt food, they will exempt pharmaceutical medications, prescription medications. Some states will exempt a certain amount of clothing because those are considered the staples of life. So to try and keep our sales tax as progressive as possible, we exempt those staples of life from the sales tax. Then we also have non-tax revenue. Non-tax revenue can be things such as user charges and user fees. What we have seen in the wake of Proposition 13 in 1978 is that a lot of local governments in California have moved away from property tax revenue and have moved more toward non-tax revenue sources such as user charges and user fees. There is a difference between user charges and user fees, even though local governments tend to use these interchangeably with each other. A user charge is revenue that is derived from the consumption of some type of a service. So in terms of utilities, you may have a user charge applied to the consumption of utilities. The more utilities you use, the more you pay in terms of user charges. With a user fee, user fees are usually not tied to a level of consumption. User fees are usually tied to regulating the participation in a certain type of behavior or activity. So to drive a car, you have to get a driver's license, and there'll be a fee charged for that driver's license. You're paying a fee for the privilege of being able to drive on the roads in California. You get a hunting license, you'll have to pay a fee for that hunting license, the privilege of engaging in hunting or fishing. If you open a franchise, in a lot of communities, you'll have to pay a franchise fee. That franchise fee is a fee for the privilege of operating that franchise within that jurisdiction. But we have seen this pronounced shift away from relying upon property taxes and more toward relying upon non-tax sources of revenue, such as user fees and user charges. When we cannot balance our revenues and expenditures, that results in what we call a deficit. So if your expenditures exceed your revenues in one given fiscal year, you are running what is called a deficit. If you run deficits every single year, the accumulation of those deficits will accumulate into your debt. The difference between debt and deficits, a deficit is an imbalance between revenues and expenditures in one fiscal year. Debt is long-term. So there's good debt and there's bad debt. If your debt is the accumulation of all these annual deficits, then that's bad debt, because obviously you're not balancing your books year after year, and that's then accumulating into a long-term debt. Good debt could be money that you borrow to construct an important and needed public capital project. So we really do need to reconstruct this bridge. And so we have to make this bridge safe. And so we're going to borrow money to then construct this bridge and make this bridge safer. That's good debt. There's a good reason for you to borrow that money. When governments borrow money, they can borrow money in the long term or they can borrow money in the short term. Short-term debt is considered to be a maturity of less than 1 year, so you pay it off in less than a year. Long-term debt tends to be a maturity of more than 1 year, so I may pay it off in 10 years or 20 years or 30 years or 40 years. Long-term debt is what we typically use to pay for our public capital projects. So for that recreation center, that city hall, that new school, we're usually going to pay for it by borrowing money. And we issue bonds. Bonds are the most common vehicle of long-term debt for governments, especially for local governments. There are different types of bonds that all have their own advantages and disadvantages. The most traditional type of bond is what's called a general obligation bond. In a general obligation bond, the government is pledging its full faith and credit. I'll put that in text, the full faith and credit to repay this debt. So basically what the city is saying is we're going to issue this general obligation bond, and we are going to pledge that we will do anything we need to do in order to repay the investors who purchase this debt. If we need to lay people off, if we need to sell facilities, declare facilities as surplus, we'll do whatever we need to do in order to repay this general obligation debt. Because the city is guaranteeing that it will do whatever it needs to do to repay this debt, it's a very low risk investment for your investors. And you know, whenever you do investments, there is this relationship between risk and reward. The lower the risk, the lower the reward. The higher the risk, the higher the reward. So general obligation debt is a very low risk investment, which means that the interest rates that the government pays to repay that debt will be very low. So the cheapest type of debt you can usually issue would be a general obligation bond. And that's usually what we use to pay for a lot of our general purpose types of capital projects. Another type of bond is what's called a revenue bond. A revenue bond is higher risk for the investor because for a revenue bond, we are not guaranteeing our full faith and credit to repay the debt, but instead of the revenue bond, we're saying we are going to repay the debt with the amount of revenue that we generate from this facility that we are constructing. So we're going to construct a recreation center and we're going to charge people dues. We're going to probably charge them membership dues to use this recreation center. We're then going to collect that revenue we get from those membership dues, and we're going to use that money to then repay the debt. If that's the situation we're dealing with, we could issue a revenue bond. The advantage of a revenue bond for a government is you don't have that full faith and credit provision. So if the recreation center goes belly up and it doesn't produce enough revenue, then the investors just don't get repaid. The problem, though, is that's a higher risk for the investors. And so they're going to demand a higher rate of return on their investment. So the interest rates are much higher on a revenue bond than they would be in a general obligation bond. So it'll cost you a lot more money to issue a revenue bond than a general obligation bond. A combination of the two is what's called a double barrel bond. Part of the debt feature will be general obligation in nature. Part of it will be revenue bond in nature. So you can kind of balance the best of two worlds with this type of a double barrel bond. There are lots of other bonds that are beyond the scope of this class to get into, things like capital appreciation bonds and lease rental bonds and sale leaseback bonds. And there are all kinds of other manifestations of bonds that governments use to borrow money. The general obligation bond is the one that we typically see used a lot at the local level. General obligation bonds, however, will usually require voter approval. And that's one of the downsides of a general obligation bond. Oftentimes, revenue bonds do not require that voter approval. General obligation bonds oftentimes do. And oftentimes that voter approval here in California will be a 2/3 supermajority in order to be able to issue that general obligation bond, unless you're a school district. If you're a school district, you can issue what's called a Prop 39 bond. You only need a 55% voter approval. But for the most part, most general obligation bonds will require 2/3 of your voters to approve in order to be able to issue those bonds. Pension obligation bonds are kind of a different kind of animal because the pension obligation bonds, you're securing those with the pension proceeds. They're going to be a little bit different. They're probably going to be more in the realm of a special revenue type of bond as opposed to a general obligation type of bond. So you got that dedicated stream of revenue that you are using to repay it. Let's see, that's it for a general obligation bond to the city. They need to have a certain credit rating to issue. That's an excellent point. For all of these bonds, yes. For all these bonds, when you issue these bonds, you need to go and get a credit approval, a credit rating. And that credit rating is given by organizations such as Standard & Poor's, Moody's, and Fitch's. Those are three of the main credit rating agencies. So you would apply to those credit rating agencies to get a bond rating. Those credit rating agencies would then come and they would look at all of your different characteristics of your city, how you're using the debt, what your current debt burden is, what your property tax base is. They'll go through dozens and dozens of different fiscal indicators. They will then do an analysis and put together a bond rating. The best bond rating you can get is a AAA bond rating. If you get a AAA bond rating, you'll have a very low interest rate that you'll have to pay because investors will be secure that they're going to get their money back because you're a very credit-worthy city. A AA, you're still probably going to get a very good interest rate. Once you start getting into the BBB level and below, that's where your interest rates really go up. And so, yes, whatever bond you are issuing, you're going to have to go out there and get a bond rating from one of those rating agencies. The better the rating, the lower the interest rate you would need to pay. But then for a general obligation bond, on top of that bond rating, you also would then have to get voter approval. And the reason why you need to get voter approval for a general obligation bond is that a lot of states will have bond limitations, bond indebtedness limitations they will place upon local governments. And those limitations are limitations that apply primarily to general obligation bonds. So a revenue bond will not be subject to that state limitation on the amount of general obligation bonds that you can issue. So you will have to determine whether or not you have enough capacity to issue that general obligation bond. And then you'll have to go out and get voter approval, and you'll have to get a bond rating to determine what your interest rate will be in order to repay that debt. And I'm saying interest rates in the bond language of bonds, we refer to interest rates as coupon rates. And the reason why they're called coupon rates is because in the old days, investors would get a coupon book whenever they would purchase debt. And then every time they were owed interest, they would rip off a coupon and they'd mail that coupon in, and then they would get money paid back to them from the government. Obviously, we don't use coupons anymore. Everything's done through electronic fund transfer, and so we don't use coupons, but we still refer to interest rates as coupon rates when we are dealing with bonds and borrowing of money. Then there's short-term debt. Short-term debt's referred to as being notes. So bonds are long-term debt, more than 1 year in maturity. Notes are short-term debt. They mature in usually less than 1 year. Short-term notes, short-term debt, those are oftentimes used to offset an imbalance between our revenues and our expenditures. So if we're coming to the end of the fiscal year and it looks like our expenditures are exceeding our revenues, for local governments here in California, you are precluded from running a deficit according to the California State Constitution. So what you need to do is you need to enhance your revenues very quickly. And the way in which you can do that is by borrowing money. So you might issue what's called a revenue anticipation note. And that revenue anticipation note, that money will then be secured, the repayment will be secured by the revenue that you are generating at the beginning of the new fiscal year. Sometimes you can issue tax anticipation notes. If you have tax collections that are coming in within the next month or so, issue a tax anticipation note, secure that note then with those tax revenues as they come in. There are also what are called bond anticipation notes. There are grant anticipation notes. But again, those are very short-term borrowing mechanisms, oftentimes used to try and avoid an imbalance, a deficit between revenues and expenditures. So not all debt is bad. If we are borrowing money for the purpose of constructing a needed public project, that is good debt. However, if our debt is just the accumulation of deficits, that's considered to be bad debt. At the federal level, a lot of our national debt is the accumulation of running deficits year after year after year, and the size of those deficits becoming bigger and bigger and bigger. So at the federal level, the budgeting process, I think one way to term it is that it's out of control, in that we very rarely get our budgets done on time. And not only do we not get our budgets done on time, but we are unable to balance our revenues and our expenditures. So we have a problem getting things done on time, and we have a problem with running deficits. So the federal budget process has really been marked by continuous attempts at reform. And every decade, we try to reform the budgeting process to bring it under control. And I won't spend a whole lot of time on this, but in the 1970s, the primary reform approach was what was called the Budget and Impoundment Control Act. And the Budget and Impoundment Control Act did a lot of things that are kind of beyond the scope of this class to talk about. But one of the major things that happened in the Budget and Impoundment Control Act is we changed the fiscal year. This is where the fiscal year became in October 1st to September 30th fiscal year. And we also created these House and Senate budget committees to give a centralized starting point for the president's budget when it arrived at Congress. The whole purpose of the Budget and Impoundment Control Act was to try and control the process and give Congress some additional tools to try and control the process. That didn't work. It was passed in 1974, and by the time we get into the 1980s, we're still not getting our budgets done on time. We're still not bringing our budgets in terms of balancing our revenues and expenditures. The process was still pretty much out of control. And another thing that we did in the Budget and Impoundment Control Act to try and avoid deficits was the use of these budget resolutions. I talked to you about earlier about the concurrent resolution on the budget. In the Budget and Impoundment Control Act, we had a series of 2 different budget resolutions, again, meant to try and impose fiscal discipline on Congress in the way in which it was spending money. Didn't work. So you get in the 1980s, and we have these deficits that are getting larger and larger with each passing year. So in the 1980s, we decided the primary problem with the budget process is not necessarily the process like it was in the 1970s, but now the problem is identified as deficits. We need to attack deficits head on in order to eliminate these deficits. So we got a couple of pieces of legislation known informally as Graham-Rudman-Hollings 1 and 2. 1 in 1985 and 2 in 1987. Essentially what Graham-Rudman-Hollings did is it established, and it's named after the 3 gentlemen on the screen, Phil Graham, Warren Rudman, and Fritz Hollings, a Republican a would-be eventual independent, and then a Democrat in Fritz Hollings. So it's a bipartisan piece of legislation that established maximum deficit amounts. So put together this timetable and said, we have these maximum deficit amounts that we cannot go above. And then in every year of the timetable, the maximum deficit target would get smaller and smaller until after 20 years, the maximum deficit target would be 0 and we would have eliminated deficits. It makes sense in a classroom type of discussion that, sure, if you keep reducing your deficit target, eventually you'll get down to 0 and you'll eliminate deficits. The problem was that Congress never abided by those deficit targets. And so if Congress, their deficit was coming in above the deficit target, they would just revise the deficit target upward and then start over again and revise their timetable. And so every year they were increasing their deficit target, and deficits instead went up as opposed to going down. So Granberg and Hollings just simply did not work in terms of focusing on deficits. So in 1990, we got this other big piece of legislation known as the Budget Enforcement Act. And in the Budget Enforcement Act, we decided instead of focusing on deficits, we should focus on the underlying cause of deficits, which is spending. If we can control runaway spending, we'll then in turn be able to eliminate these deficits. So in the Budget Enforcement Act, what we did is we created 3 different categories of spending: domestic, international, and defense. And we established firewalls between those 3 different categories. So you could not rob from one category to pay for programs in another category. If you wanted to increase spending on a domestic program, you would have to pay for it by decreasing spending on another domestic program within that same category. It implemented this approach that came to be known as PAYGO. And PAYGO stood for pay as you go. If you want to increase spending, you have to do that with paying for it with a decrease in spending in another area. You cannot increase spending by borrowing more money. The Budget Enforcement Act had somewhat of a successful tenure in that it did impose some fiscal discipline on how Congress is spending their money. And that combined with balanced budget acts in 1993, 1997, as well as a very quickly growing economy. In the 1990s, remember, we had the dot-com boom. And the Silicon Valley, we had all this money that was coming in terms of revenue from these internet companies and the creation of all these tech companies. There was a huge influx of revenue to the federal government. We had economic growth rates on a quarterly basis upwards of 6, 7, and 8%. When your economy is growing that quickly, you are generating a lot of revenue for federal government coffers. So we were bringing in a lot of revenue. At the same time, we were imposing some spending discipline through the Budget Enforcement Act and these balanced budget acts in the 1990s, so much so that we finally, in 1999, got to a place of surplus spending. And for 2 years, in 1999 and 2000, we were spending less money than we were bringing in, and our revenues were actually exceeding our expenditures, at least on paper. Then September 11th happened, and in the wake of September 11th, we had the war in Iraq, the war in Afghanistan, all this military spending, all these hits to our economy, and we then went right back into deficit spending after 2001, and we have remained in deficit spending every year since then. So even though we have tried to reform the budgeting process by in the 1970s focusing on the process itself, in the 1980s focusing on eliminating deficits, in the 1990s focusing on limiting spending, our budgeting process still is out of control in that we're still not getting budgets done on time, and we're still not bringing in more revenue than we are spending in our expenditures. The moral of the story, to kind of wrap this up, is that eliminating deficits is not really a function of changing the process. It's more a function of political will. And until we have members of Congress and a president who have the willpower to make the difficult decisions in terms of increasing revenue and decreasing expenditures, we're never going to get back to that point in time of surplus spending. Unless we have the political will to work in a bipartisan way in order to come to bipartisan negotiations and agreements on these appropriation bills, we are never going to get our budgets done on time. So it's much more of a matter of political will than it is procedural changes. I think that's kind of the future of budgeting, unfortunately, at least at the federal level. we continue to see the two parties moving in opposite directions. We see the Republican Party moving more conservative, the Democratic Party moving more liberal, hollowing out that middle ground whereby we usually are able to come to negotiated settlements in the budgeting process. So I think if anything, the process of coming to a agreement on the budget, getting our appropriation bills done on time, and avoiding deficits, those processes are going to become even more difficult in the future. And as we're seeing here in the state of California, as a lot of that federal spending for COVID relief has gone away, we're now really starting to see the impacts of COVID on our state economy. Through COVID, we were shocked at how well our economy was doing. We had budget surpluses in the billions of dollars. Now this year, we're looking at a pretty substantial budget deficit, somewhere in the range of about $30 to $35 billion, which will require some reorientation in terms of how we are spending money and the types of programs we're going to need to cut. I think that's kind of the delayed effect of the COVID pandemic. That delayed effect of the COVID pandemic was very much masked by a lot of this federal spending for state and local governments throughout the pandemic itself. So I do think, as a gentleman on the screen has those empty pockets, I do think the future of budgeting, at least at the state level and probably at the federal level as well, will be a very difficult process in terms of not having enough revenue to cover our expenditures and having a lot of difficulty coming to negotiated settlements to get our budgets done on time, at least at the federal level. So it's kind of your introduction to management of fiscal resources and budgeting. Again, it just kind of creates a framework for you to go into your PPA 555 public budgeting course. And so a lot of these things you'll learn in public budgeting are not going to be brand new to you. We've at least broached those topics in this class. You'll just get a lot more flesh on the bones, if you will, for a lot of these topics once you get to 555. And that then takes us through all of our information. I think what we have done in our limited time together in this course is we have provided a justification for why we study public administration. We have distinguished public administration from private administration. We have talked about public administration as a discipline and what it takes to be a discipline in public administration. We've talked about some of the heightened accountability requirements for being a public leader as opposed to being a leader in the private sector. We've talked about how the theoretical underpinnings of public administration have evolved over the past 150 years and how our orientation toward organizations changed. We've talked about differences between public policies and public programs and what public administrators do in the formulation, implementation, and evaluation of public policies and public programs. We've dealt with the issue of trying to make government more effective and coming up with a uniform definition of what we mean by effectiveness. And we've talked about more of those discrete functions of public administrators, such as how we manage our personnel, our human resources in our organizations, and how we manage taxpayer money in terms of the management of our financial resources. And so I think we've kind of covered everything to give you a good jumping off point, a good basis for moving forward in the program and really understanding why you're in an MPA program and why we study public administration differently than we might study if we were in other types of disciplines. So that's my story and I'm sticking to it. So that's all of our information we're covering in this class. We're not going to cover performance measurement in this class because I think that it's not really necessary for you to have a good solid basis for moving forward in the program. So we'll forego that brief discussion of performance measurement. And we've now covered all the information you need to do a good job on your final assessment. So I think where that leaves us is next week, what we'll do is we'll just call next week our final assessment. And so we won't have a live session next week. You can just work on your final assessment, use that time to finish up the final assessment. I will be available via email. So if you do have any questions, last minute questions or concerns on the final assessment, I will be available to answer any of those questions or concerns that you might have. Then you'll get your Canvas essay number 5 along with the 2 responses turned in by the 13th. Your final assessment then turned in by midnight on the 14th, next Tuesday. I will then spend a day or two grading those final assessments, and then I'll have your grades ready to go probably no later than Thursday of next week. And then you'll be able to move onward and upward. If you have a second half hybrid course, you can then have the decks cleared for 500 and then move onward and upward to your next course in the program. Any questions or concerns or observations or anything else in our final 5 minutes or so together tonight? Hopefully everything is as clear as we say a muddy river. I know we covered a lot of information in this class in a very short period of time, but this really is your initial foray into the program. And so if we've prepared you for succeeding in your future core courses and really introduce you to the field of public administration, I think we've accomplished our goals in this course. Okay, thanks, Jay. All right, well, thank you, everyone. Again, if you have any questions as you're working on the final assessment or your Canvas essay number 5, feel free to reach out to me, send me an email. Otherwise, we won't have a need for a live session next week. You'll just finish up your final assessment, and then I'll get your grades all done by probably Thursday of next week. Okay. All right, thank you very much, everyone. It's been a pleasure. Hope this has been useful for you. We will have the recording available for you tomorrow morning, and so you can go ahead and watch this at your leisure if you need it in order to complete your final assessment. Thanks, everyone. Good luck in the program, and you'll be getting your final grade from me within about 7 or 8 days or so. So thank you. Take care. Have a great week.